Hello friends, thanks for watching. I wanted to say welcome to my new subscribers, and I wanted to do a very quick video on what I'm talking about in my YouTube channel. I was raised in a very unique subculture of society. And I think that the academic name for the group that I was raised in would be a new religious movement. It was founded in the 1960s, a group of hippies led by a pastor who had been kicked out repeatedly of church after church after church for his radical and crazy ideas, which didn't really come to fruition until he started his own new religious movement in the 1960s. He was a Christian evangelical fundamentalist who believed in the apocalyptic end time and that there was a core group of people who should follow Jesus Christ in a very specific religious context, and that context was based on his own alchemy. He took he took some very occult beliefs in regards to spiritism and along with faith healing and the Book of Revelations, and created his own very sinister version of the way that things should be. So when I was 19 years old, I gave birth to my daughter, and her father and I, for the 9 months that I was pregnant, sat around talking and developing our own ideas on what we thought was wrong with the way that we were being raised. When she was born, we wrote a letter and we sent it to the leaders. And within just a few weeks, they had sent us a reply telling him that he was kicked out. He had to leave no matter what. And I had the choice either to stay or to go. And I left. So I left at 19 years old. I was in Rhode Island, up in the Northeast. And that was kind of where I really began to experience reality for the first time. I spent hours watching TV, tried to catch up on music, got to drink alcohol for the first time, and kind of had an introduction to reality along with being a new mother. I didn't stay with her father for very long. I went out on my own and started my own life. Some of the belief systems that I had been taught as a child in the new religious movement that I was raised in, along with what I was learning, and I started to develop my own ideas. I imagined in my mind that I had this foundation in childhood, and I imagined that I was taking it apart brick by brick, looking at this, looking at that, throwing away all of the things that didn't resonate with me anymore. And as I was pulling this foundation apart, I was also building a new foundation with what I believed. At one moment, I embraced atheism, and I was very comfortable with that feeling of absolute silence after death. And I think that I needed to go to that 0 point almost so that I could kind of use that as my starting point for, okay, let's start with this. And I kind of began to build on that. Just about that time, my friend, who was younger than me, but was a huge influencer in my life. She died tragically in a one-car accident. And that sent me into a deep depression. And in that depression, I began to experiment. I had some of my first experiences with psychedelics. And in one of those experiences, I was tripping hard. And somehow I had gone to my friend's funeral, and in this moment, I was immediately inside of her coffin with her dead body. And, it was kind of like one of those, it was a Lazarus moment. It was, he's not here, only sleeping, I became completely aware of the fact that, yeah, she's gone, but she's still somewhere. I could still feel her almost. And I kind of called her to me because it was very scary being in this trip inside of her coffin. And I remembered Jesus, who, in my younger years, in my teenage years, even inside of the group, I was in the group. I was kind of marked because they had to choose someone as a scapegoat, and my mother and my father were scapegoats in the adult age range, meaning that they were called out publicly by leadership and publicly disciplined, verbally, had to confess their sins, etc. So I was marked in that way as well as a teenager, and had what was called a public exposure when we lived in Japan, and they sent out a letter to the entire country. And, I'm going to say that in Japan at that time, in the group, there were probably about 5,000 people. So it was quite a humiliating experience. But even in spite of all that crap that was going on as a teenager, I felt like it was a shitstorm that was happening around me, but I still felt very much connected to Source. And at that time in my life, Source was Jesus. So when I was in the middle of this trip, I called out and I started to repeat the salvation prayer, which is, Jesus, please come into my heart. Forgive me for my sins, fill me with your eternal love and your Holy Spirit. And, of course, I'm having a psychedelic experience, I'm not going to lie. But I also, in that moment, had this massive spiritual epiphany because I had a light that shined down on me, and I could feel it coming through my halo. And I was totally covered in love, in a very loving, warm, spiritual light that told me that everything was going to be okay. So when I came down from that, I decided that any time that I was going to do any type of experimentation, that it was not going to be to forget reality. It was going to be to see what else was out there. So I was in college, so I would spend days really in the library, in the religious and spiritual section, just pulling out books and reading as much as I could in between my studies, which I needed to do for the classes that I was in. And I also started therapy at that time. And the first time that I really sat down and I got to speak with a therapist, the therapist told me that my childhood was the most traumatic that she had ever met. And that was very odd for me to feel like, what? I went through something that was traumatic and very abusive, mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, sexually. And so I had a raging eating disorder at that moment. And really the goal of my search, my spiritual search, was to heal myself so that I didn't pass that sickness on to my daughter. So fast forward 19 years, okay? So I have a bookshelf full of the books that I've been collecting and reading. I have journals full of everything that I've been writing about. And I was in and out of therapy for years and years, working through the eating disorder. I chose to look at the eating disorder as a tool that served me well when I needed it in my childhood. And then I came to understand that, it was a tool that was no longer useful, and that it was something that I had to break myself of. So I'm happy to say that probably about 10 years ago is really where I got a grip on the eating disorder and quit with the binge, purge, starve, binge, purge, starve cycle. I would go through this anorexic, bulimic, cycle that was very difficult. It was a lot of subconscious work that I had to do to process all of that and heal. And then I went away from the traditional therapy and began to really delve into taking responsibility for the healing myself. I connected to some of the pagan belief systems. I began to understand that there was a feminine aspect of the Godhead besides the masculine, which I had understood as a child because the leader of the group had a whole set of visions that he had where he was in direct communication with many different feminine aspects of the Godhead. So, again, I was tearing apart the foundation that I had been given and looking at each brick individually and deciding what it was that I was going to keep and what I was going to discard. So I began to do ritual work, and that's really where I began to understand magic. And as I began to do magic, I started to begin to remember things from childhood that I hadn't really consciously remembered. I decided to go back into therapy, and I chose to work with a hypnotherapist. Because I had done so many years of work myself in journaling, in traditional therapy, in meditations, in reading and speaking with others, when I went into hypnotherapy, I had a very strong foundation. So I was very quickly able to experience breakthroughs. And as I did that, I began to start to understand what the quantum moment was, because when you're in the hypnotic state, you are able to go in and experience, time becomes much more malleable. And my therapist would enter into the hypnotherapy after she put me into the state. We would go back to the last dream that I had, and we would work through, the dream that I was experiencing and correct it and rectify it. When I began my study all the way back when I was in Kentucky, I began to collect crystals. I began to collect magical tools. I experienced Reiki for the first time. I began to understand what the polarity was in the healing modalities that were available. And I started to work with those things as well. So in the past few years is really when everything began to click and come together for me. And I began to remember the good stuff from childhood, the times where because I had blocked many good experiences because of the traumas that I had gone through. I had to kind of just shut out huge chapters of my life. But now that I had healed those traumatic experiences, then I was able to go back and remember the good stuff. So the picture became much clearer to me that just as much darkness, there is light. That's when I was able to kind of begin to understand the duality. And, for a long time, I focused completely on the feminine aspect of the Godhead. And what I began to realize is that I needed to find my inner masculine and begin to alchemize those things together. So really, this is what I'm talking about in my videos, is my personal journey. And what I hope is that the things that I talk about will resonate with you. And I think a really important key is to understand that whatever story we were given in childhood is the blueprint, right, of who we are, right? And so in order for us to overcome and heal, we have to be able to jump out of these blueprints and create new storylines. Even when we create new storylines, there's a circuity to what we're doing. And the blueprint, if you will, doesn't have to stay exactly the same, but you are going to continue to have the same emotional scars, and you have to work through the same issues. But the idea is that we are jumping up in this spiritual spiral of learning. And when you come back to a lesson that you've learned from going around all the way to the other side, that when you come back to it, you're more complete and you're whole, and you're able to move through the lesson at a higher level and have more of a rounded experience, and be able to grow from that and move into the next thing. So where I am today is clearly my life right now is the happiest that it's ever been. I feel like, I was 19 years in the group, and now I've been 19 years out. So really right now is like this balancing point where I've had just as much time out of the group as I had in the group. And so I look at myself and I say, have I made enough progress? Am I happy with what I've done? Because when I left the group, I made a decision to leave. I said, am I going to do something with my life that is worth leaving? Because when I left the group, I was absolutely positive that I was a backslider, that I was an apostate, and that God was going to strike me dead. So coming from that to an understanding that I have now, that, with free will and free choice, we are able to heal ourselves. And then once we've healed, we're able to do the good work that needs to be done to remove everyone in this reality from all of the little cults and all the people who feel like they need to be the one leading, and freeing people from this old paradigm that we've moved out of. So 20-minute video. I didn't mean to go that long. I can't seem to get any shorter. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Anyways, that's kind of a background of what I'm talking about on my YouTube channel and why I'm speaking. And thank you again for subscribing to my channel. And I'll be talking to you guys soon. All right, bye.